For over 1,000 years, the HFY Dominion had ruled the galaxy with an unbreakable grip. Their empire stretched across thousands of worlds, their fleets unmatched, their armies unstoppable. Wherever they went, they brought conquest, destruction, and fear. Fear was a weapon, a tool they had mastered. They didn't just conquer planets, they crushed the spirit of those they invaded. They made sure their enemies never even thought of resisting. To the HFY, fear was a weakness, something that only lesser beings experienced. They saw themselves as superior, immune to such primitive emotions. They had raised entire civilizations, enslaved countless species, and never once had they known what it felt like to be afraid. But that belief was about to be shattered. In the heart of the Dominion's flagship, Supreme Commander Karish stood in the war chamber, surrounded by his most trusted officers. The walls were lined with trophies from past conquests, skulls of alien leaders, banners from fallen worlds, and weapons taken from long-dead warriors, each one a reminder of their dominance. Before them, a massive holographic display showed their next target, a small human colony. This is what the High Command is concerned about. An admiral scoffed, crossing his arms. A species that only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. Laughable. Karish smirked. They call themselves humans. Their territory is insignificant, their fleets are outdated, and their soldiers are barely trained. The officers chuckled. The HFY had faced powerful civilizations before. Humanity was not one of them. They have no strategic importance, another officer added. No major resources, no superweapons, nothing that makes them worth our time. Karish leaned forward. His golden armor shimmered under the dim lights. Then let's take what we want. No negotiations, no diplomacy. His cold, reptilian eyes gleamed. We break them, like all the others. The room filled with cruel laughter. It was always the same. They had crushed the Torvins, the Dralics, the Vesheri. Each time, their enemies had begged for mercy. Each time, fear had broken them long before the HFY fired a single shot. Humanity would be no different. Hours later, the HFY fleet arrived at the human colony. Massive warships, armed with planet-destroying weaponry, surrounded the world like hungry beasts. Their engines burned with crimson energy, casting an eerie glow over the planet's surface. Admiral Varish, leading the assault, activated a system-wide transmission. His voice, cold and commanding, echoed across every city, every outpost. Humans, he said, his tone laced with contempt. You have two choices. His officers smirked. This speech had been given hundreds of times before. Surrender and serve the Dominion. Varish continued, or resist, and be erased from existence. Silence. The officers waited, expecting pleas for mercy, expecting panic, expecting fear. Instead, after a long pause, a human voice finally responded. Calm. Steady. You should have stayed away. Then the transmission cut off. A heavy silence fell over the HFY bridge. That was not the response they expected. Admiral Varish frowned. Send the attack order. The HFY ships began their assault, their weapons locking onto key targets across the planet. This was routine. Then, something went wrong. The fleet's sensors failed. Warnings flared across every HFY warship. Targeting systems flickered, enemy ships vanished from scanners, and communication between fleets suddenly collapsed. What is this? Varish barked, his sharp claws digging into the control panel. Why can't we lock onto their positions? One of his officers turned, confusion written across his face. Sir, their ships are moving too fast, too erratic. They aren't following standard battle formations. Varish's frown deepened. This was not how battles usually went. Adjust to manual targeting, he ordered. Crush them. But then, something stranger happened. One by one, HFY warships started vanishing. Not exploding, not being destroyed, just disappearing. Varish's second-in-command, a hardened veteran of dozens of campaigns, paled as he looked at the battle reports. "Sir, our ships aren't being destroyed." His voice was barely above a whisper. "They're being taken." Varish's mind struggled to process the words. Taken? By a species so weak? Impossible. Then, without warning, the bridge went dark. A flickering red emergency light cast eerie shadows on the walls. Consoles shorted out. Screens turned to static. And then, a message appeared. On every ship. On every screen. In every Selvar war room. You laughed at fear. Now, you'll learn its meaning. A chill ran through Admiral Varish's spine. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar. Something cold. Something that made his muscles tighten, his breath quicken, his heart pound in his chest. For the first time, a Selvar was afraid. Admiral Varish stood frozen in place. The bridge of his warship, once filled with the hum of control panels and the confident voices of officers, was now eerily silent. The only sound was the quiet flickering of broken screens. That message, "You laughed at fear. Now, you'll learn its meaning," still burned on every display. It shouldn't have been possible. No enemy had ever hacked the Dominion systems. No one had ever dared to play mind games with the Selvar. A cold chill crawled down his spine. "Status report," he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. The officer at the main console hesitated before responding. "Sir, our fleet's communications are completely cut off. Internal ship systems are malfunctioning. And—" He stopped, swallowing hard. Varish narrowed his eyes. "And what?" The officer turned, his face pale. "We can't locate the ships that disappeared. They're just gone." On the surface of the human colony, Captain Elias Carter watched from a hidden command center. Around him, his team of calm and focused officers monitored the battle. Unlike the Selvar, they weren't laughing. They were hunting. Elias smirked. The Selvar thought humans were weak. They thought this would be an easy battle. That was their first mistake. "They're confused," his lieutenant whispered. "They don't know what's happening." Elias nodded. "Good." For years, humanity had watched as the Selvar dominated the galaxy. Every species had surrendered before the war even began, too terrified to resist. But humans weren't like the others. When humanity learned that the Dominion would eventually reach them, they didn't run. They didn't beg for mercy. They prepared. Back in orbit, Admiral Varish clenched his fists. "This is a trick," he snarled. "These humans are trying to make us panic." He turned to his tactical officer. "Send in the second wave. Target everything. I want this colony burned to the ground." The officer swallowed hard but nodded. "Launching the next attack, sir." Selvar warships moved into position, their weapons charging up for a full planetary bombardment. The ground forces prepared to drop from orbit, ready to land and begin wiping out every human in sight. This was how it always went. No resistance, no survivors. But then, something changed. One by one, the second wave of Selvar ships went silent. No explosions, no distress signals, just silence. "What is happening?" Varish slammed his fist on the console. "Someone tell me what's going on." But no one could answer, because no one knew. On the surface, Elias Carter watched as the Selvar fleet fell apart. "It's working," one of his officers whispered. "They don't understand what's happening." Elias nodded. "Good. Let them feel it." For the first time in Selvar history, they were experiencing fear, not just the fear of losing, but the fear of the unknown. The Selvar didn't know what was hunting them, and that made them terrified. Above the planet, deep within the shadows of space, something moved. Something fast. Something that wasn't Selvar, and it was coming for them. Admiral Varish paced across the bridge of his warship. The silence in his command center was unnatural. No status updates, no enemy transmissions, nothing. just the distant hum of the ship's core. He didn't like this. The Dominion always controlled the battlefield. Every war, every invasion, had gone the same way. Overwhelming power, swift destruction, complete submission. Yet here they were, a fleet of Selvar warships, the greatest armada in the galaxy, being picked apart in total silence. Commander Drall, Varish turned sharply. What is the current fleet count? Drall's claws tapped nervously against his console. His voice wavered. Sir, out of the 40 warships in our initial strike force, we have confirmed contact with only 12. Varish froze. That wasn't possible. His mind raced. Were the humans using a new kind of cloaking weapon? A hacking virus? Some sort of trickery? We're being hunted, sir, Drall whispered, as if saying the words any louder would bring the enemy to them faster. Varish refused to accept it. The Selvar were the hunters. They were the ones who instilled fear, not the ones who felt it. And yet, his crew looked afraid. On the surface below, Captain Elias Carter stood at the heart of his command center, watching the Selvar fleet fall apart. They still don't know what's hitting them, his lieutenant said, her voice calm. They've never fought an enemy they couldn't see. Elias smirked. Good. Let's keep it that way. The humans weren't using overwhelming firepower. They weren't meeting the Selvar head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, they had taken control of the Selvar's greatest weapon, their own fear. Step 1 had been cutting their communications, isolating their ships from one another. Step 2 was making them doubt their own strength. And now, Step 3 had begun. The real hunt. In the darkness of space, shadows moved. They weren't massive warships. They weren't fleets of dreadnoughts. They were small, fast, and lethal. Human stealth fighters darted between the Selvar warships, using the Dominion's own blind spots against them. Every Selvar vessel had massive firepower, but its targeting relied on centralized command networks. Command networks that were already dead. One by one, human fighters slipped past defenses, planting specialized EMP charges onto Selvar hulls. It was a slow, methodical process, and that Selvar couldn't stop it. On the bridge of his warship, Admiral Varish's claws tightened against the railing. A sudden flash appeared on the main screen. One of the remaining 12 ships had just vanished. Not destroyed, not attacked, just gone. The fear spread through his crew like wildfire. They had no idea what was happening. Varish growled, his voice filled with rage. I will know it be toyed with. Find those humans and YP them out. But that was the problem. The Selvar weren't in control anymore. The hunters had become the hunted. Admiral Varish could hear it now. Not from the enemy, not from his ship's alarms, but from his own crew. Whispers, uneasy glances, clawed hands gripping control panels with too much force. Even the most hardened officers were shaken. Varish hated it. The Dominion does not fear, he snarled, slamming his fist against his chair. We crush those who stand against us. We eradicate fear. But no one responded. Because the Selvar were starting to understand something terrible. Fear was no longer something they could destroy. It was inside them now. And the humans had put it there. On the surface of the planet, Captain Elias Carter observed the chaos through satellite feeds. The Selvar fleet was crumbling. They're unraveling, his lieutenant murmured. Elias nodded. The moment they start doubting themselves, the battle is already lost. This was the key to human warfare. The Selvar had always relied on their dominance, overwhelming force, psychological terror, and absolute certainty that they were the superior species. But humans understood something deeper. Terror wasn't about numbers. It wasn't about power. It was about uncertainty. Right now, the Selvar didn't know what was attacking them. They didn't know if they were safe. They didn't know who would be next. And that was the real weapon. On the Selvar flagship, one of the remaining officers broke the silence. Sir, he whispered, voice shaking. Permission to retreat. Varish snapped his head toward him, eyes burning with fury. "Did you just say, retreat?" he growled. "The Dominion does not retreat." The officer looked away, ashamed, but he didn't withdraw his request. And Varish realized, with a sinking feeling, that the thought had already spread through the crew. They were thinking about running. They were considering surrender. The Dominion's entire strength was built on fear, but now, for the first time, they were the ones feeling it. Varish clenched his fists. He had to act fast. He had to do something before the fear completely consumed them. Admiral Varish's breathing was ragged. His claws dug into the armrests of his command chair as his eyes darted across the tactical screens. Ship after ship was falling silent, not exploding, not reporting damage, just gone. He slammed his fist onto the control panel. "Show me the enemy. I want a full sensor sweep. Now." "Sir, we already tried," a technician said, his voice trembling. "There's nothing. No signatures, no energy readings. It's like they're ghosts." Varish's blood ran cold. Ghosts. He had laughed when he first heard the humans call themselves the Ghost Fleet, another pathetic species using dramatics to hide their weakness. But now, as his mighty warships vanished one by one, the name felt very real. And for the first time in his long, brutal career, he understood why prey feared the dark. On the human command deck, Elias Carter leaned forward, watching the Selvar fleet crumble. "They're at the edge now," his lieutenant murmured. "One more push and they'll break." Elias nodded. "Then let's give them exactly what they fear most." With a flick of his wrist, he activated the final phase of the operation. Across the battlefield, hidden human warships deactivated their stealth fields, just for a moment, just long enough for the Selvar to see them. Hundreds of ships surrounding them. It was a lie. The humans didn't have that many warships. Most of them were projections, false energy readings placed in perfect formation. But the Selvar didn't know that. All they saw was death closing in. On the bridge of the Selvar flagship, silence reigned. The moment the human ships appeared, the crew froze. No one screamed. No one shouted. They simply understood. There was no victory here. There was no fight left to win. The Dominion's era of fear and conquest had come to an end, and humanity had proven them wrong. Varish's claws trembled against his chair. His fleet was shattered. His warriors were broken. And worst of all, his own people feared him less than they feared the humans. A single message flashed across his screen. A transmission sent by the human commander himself. It contained only 2 words: "Run now." And for the first time in history, the Selvar Dominion fled. Admiral Varish sat in stunned silence. His empire, his people, they were running. The Selvar Dominion had ruled through fear for centuries. Their warships had crushed countless civilizations. No species had ever dared to stand against them. Until now. Until humanity. The Ghost Fleet had broken them. Varish's officers were abandoning their posts, scrambling for escape pods, whispering to each other in hushed, terrified voices. He could feel their thoughts, their doubts. If the humans are this powerful, what else have they been hiding? His hands tightened into fists. He refused to accept this. He would not let his legacy end in disgrace. With a sharp motion, he activated the emergency fleet-wide broadcast. Every remaining Selvar soldier on every ship would hear his words. "Stop running." His voice was cold, firm. "You are warriors of the Dominion. You do not run from prey." No response. He hated the silence. He switched the transmission to a direct channel, to every Selvar commander still alive. But before he could speak, a voice interrupted him. "Admiral," a general said quietly, "this isn't about pride anymore." Varish's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "We have lost." The general's voice trembled. "They broke us without even showing their full strength. If we continue fighting, we may not survive at all." Varish growled. his claws digging into the chair. Cowards. Every single one of them. He turned his gaze to the battle reports, or what was left of them. Entire fleets missing. Armies surrendering. Planets falling into panic. And the worst part, the humans had not sent a single demand. No messages demanding surrender. No speeches of dominance. No orders to bow to a new ruler. They didn't want to rule. They wanted the Selvar to understand something far worse. Fear is not power. Fear is a weakness. For centuries, the Dominion had used fear to break others. Now, humanity had turned that same weapon against them. And it was working. A new transmission flashed onto his screen. Another message from the humans. But this time, it wasn't just 2 words. It was a choice. We can end this now, or you can learn what true terror is. Varish's claws trembled. Because for the first time in his life, he knew the humans weren't bluffing. Admiral Varish stood alone on the bridge of his shattered warship. Around him, the once proud Selvar Dominion was collapsing. Humanity had not needed a massive fleet. They had not needed to bombard planets or conquer territories. They had used something far more powerful. They had turned fear against the Selvar. And now, the empire that had ruled the galaxy through terror was drowning in it. The Selvar homeworld was in chaos. Citizens were panicking. Military bases were being abandoned. Entire colonies were declaring independence. And worst of all, no one was trying to stop it. The war had ended before it had truly begun. The Selvar, who had spent centuries laughing at fear, had finally learned what true fear was. A final transmission came through. It was from Elias Carter, the human commander who had orchestrated the fall of the Dominion. His face was calm, unreadable. There was no hatred in his expression, no anger, just understanding. "Now you understand," he said simply. Varish's claws trembled. "You ruled through fear," Carter continued. "You thought it made you powerful. But fear is a weak foundation. The moment someone proves they don't fear you, everything collapses." Varish's breath was shaky. The humans had not just defeated the Dominion. They had proved that fear had limits. And beyond those limits, there was only humanity. Carter's voice came through one last time. "This was your only warning." Then the screen went dark. Varish closed his eyes. He knew, without a doubt, that history would remember this moment. Not as a war, but as the day the Dominion fell to its own weapon. And as the day the galaxy truly learned to fear humanity.